Good evening again. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, November 6, 2018 to order with roll call, please. Will you hit that button, please?
Kostler?
Here.
McAlpine?
Here.
Kraus?
Here.
Betts?
Here.
Weinhammer?
Here.
Cavelli?
Here.
Thank you. Would you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll now move to the public comment portion. If there's anybody here who would like to address the Committee of the Whole, we had nobody sign in. So we'll move forward. We'll close public comment at 7 o'clock. Moving, first order of business is a discussion on the police pension fund actuarial projection.
Well, just a number of reports this evening. Tonight we have Jason Franken from Foster & Foster to present the police pension actuarial calculation and address any questions you may have.
All right, thank you. As I mentioned, my name is Jason Franken. I'm an actuary with Foster & Foster. I'm going to be going over the results of the May 1st, 2000 actuarial evaluation. So each year we collect all the personnel data, we compare that to the assets. After we determine our liability, the assets to determine such things as the unfunded liability in the plan, what the funded ratio is, as well as the contribution requirement. So in this particular year, as of May 1, 2018, we are showing that the recommended contribution for the village be increased from where it was last year at $854,000 up to $890,000 this year. And some of that increase is just the natural escalation in the plan, but during this particular year, we did make a few assumption changes. Many of the assumption changes were tables,
those type of things that were released by the Department of Insurance in October of last year.
Changes were changes that we think need to be made. You know, really they're the first step towards changes that we think need to be made in order to reflect the actual financial status of the plan and develop a contribution pattern that's more sustainable and not nearly as backloaded as it might have been in the past. So the first assumption that we changed was to update the investment return assumption. This is the rate that we expect the fund to earn over the long term. We have been at 7.5%. We lowered it to 7.25% this year, so we lowered it by 25 basis points. However, you know, we don't think that that's the last step that needs to be taken. I think we need to continue to lower that rate of return to be in more line with the actual expectations. Your fund, the police pension plan, has substantial investment restrictions that are in place that are in the Illinois pension code. So the pension fund can't be invested as, say, the IMRF plan can be invested because they don't have the restrictions that your plan has. So to have the same assumption that IMRF uses is, you know, probably a little bit aggressive and probably a lot aggressive, actually. So we took our first step to lower that rate. You know, ultimately, I think we probably need to be around 6.75%, but going from 7.5% to 6.75% in 1 year would probably result in a contribution increase that would be difficult to swallow. So rather than taking it in one step, we've taken it in 3 steps. We plan to take it in 3 steps. So that was that's the big driver of the assumption changes. The other one was that we reduced our payroll growth assumption from 4.5% to 4.25%.
Yeah.
So this payroll growth assumption is used to determine what your amortization payment is, how much you're paying each year in your unfunded liability. And by lowering that rate, we've essentially decreased the steepness of our pension ramp. So by going from 4.5 down to 4.25, it actually increases today's contribution a little bit, but lowers the contributions that the village will have to make down the road. And so, again, these are changes that we think need to be made, and I don't think that this is the last step. I think we need to continue to, lower those two assumptions to make the long-term contributions a little more sustainable than what they would have been using the assumptions that we've been using in the past. So quickly, the unfunded liability in the plan, you got a little bit of a preview of that in the prior meeting. The unfunded liability went from about 8.3 million up to 8.9 million this year. That increase was, like I said, mostly driven by that change to the discount rate, or the interest rate. When you lower the amount of investment income that you think you're going to get, it increases the contributions that are needed from the village, and thus increases the liability for the plan. The funded ratio for the plan, it increased a little bit from 57% up to 57.4%. So there's a little bit of an increase, even after making that investment return assumption change, but it was very marginal, very marginal increase. So we touched on it at the beginning, but the recommended contribution increased by about $36,000 this year, from 854 up to 890,000. So just to give you an idea of regarding the investment return assumption, that 7.5%, I went back, and since May 1st of 2011, so there's been 7 years. There's only been 2 years in that 7-year period where the plan has earned in excess of 7.5%. And in those 2 years, they earned 7.71 and 7.88. So they barely exceeded that 7.5% assumption 2 out of the last 7 years. In the other 5 years, we had, in a couple of cases, especially in the
2016 fiscal year end, there were significant losses. So again, continue to lower that assumption in the future, as well as lower our payroll growth assumption, and both of those items are going to put upward pressure on our contribution requirement in the short term, but over the long term, it will better reflect the financial state of the pension plan and make the contributions a little bit more manageable. So those are the highlights of the report. Are there any questions that I can answer for you guys?
I just have quick questions. For what do you think realistically those should be at? I mean, obviously, we're going to take them in small increments because we can't financially afford that. But what do you think is realistic, so we can have an idea from a long-term planning standpoint, what should we be thinking those should be at?
Yeah, so I think from an interest rate assumption perspective, now that the plan is over $10 million, you do have some more opportunity to invest in more equities, for example.
Right.
So I think 6.75% is probably a reasonable assumption based on if you had a 60 or 65% in equities, that's a reasonable assumption, and in line with other plans over $10 million in the state. Most of them are at 6.75. Some of them are at 7. Some are, probably fewer than are at 6.5. So I think 6.75 is really what I'm targeting at this point. And from a payroll growth assumption perspective, we're at 4.25. I think ultimately we need to be at 3 or 3.5 as sort of the top end. And keep in mind, this is the assumption that determines how steep your pension ramp is. So at 4.5%, it's pretty steep. If you went to 3, though it increases, it increases in the short term, but those future payments are not nearly as large, with 4.5% compound for 20, 25 years produces a contribution requirement that is massively increased from where we started. So trying to eliminate some of that backloading, I think, is an important goal, because pensions are pay now or pay later. And when you're paying later, you have to not only pay your original unfunded amount, but you have to pay all the compound interest that you didn't earn on that. If you put the money in now, you get the benefit of the compound interest. So as best we can, trying to shift some of that obligation from 2030 to 2040 to today, would be in the long-term best interest of the village.
I think to that point, we need to continue to look at ways where we can drive that assumed rate of return down. Certainly that becomes complicated here just given our financial situation, and every time we move that needle a little bit more, the contribution is more. You can see in here, we're going to 7.5, 7.25. I think that was what the village board had asked for last year, and we're able to do that here this year. But with that said, we're also going to see another $40,000 that we're going to have the general fund absorb essentially. So there's an additional cost. We're going from 850,000 plus or minus to 890,000. So it's significant. It's significant, but it's also important to continue to move that assumed rate of return down.
Any other comments?
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes, you can,
We did
Scott.
last year, and it's worth noting, I think, that this is an obligation of the village. This is not a voluntary contribution made by the village. They're required to make the contributions to this pension plan. And the unfunded liability that you've mentioned repeatedly is something that this board did not create. That unfunded liability comes from decades of inadequate funding of the system that now has to be made up by this board. So the board is acting in a responsible fashion in meeting its actuarial obligation for this year, plus an additional contribution to meet the unfunded liability going forward. Just to note that it's a difficult obligation for the board to meet, for the village to meet each year, but it's required. And there is an unfunded debt that is being addressed on an annual basis by this board in an attempt to be fiscally responsible.
And there are potential, long-term, if we aren't meeting that, the LDGF money could be taken from us also. The state could come in if we don't do that.
Right.
There could be other financial consequences.
Any other comments? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Michael, you ready to discuss our tax levy for 2018?
I wait for it every
I know you did. Bated breath. You walked in here.
He
comes in
relishes the
jumping, yeah.
opportunity.
Almost did a cartwheel.
Well,
So
as
how
we all
about
know by
numbers?
now, the Village of Cary is subject to the property tax caps being a non-home rule community. So each year, the village's tax levy can only go up by the lesser of 5% or the CPI from the preceding tax levy year. Based on the information we've received from Henry County this year, the most the village's tax levy could increase this year is 2.7%. If we increase the village's tax levy by that 2.7%, we would be able to add $67,000 to our levy. Just to a little background here, the tax levy we adopted last year was $2,510,614. The amount of new growth that was attributed to the Village of Cary this year would allow us to increase our tax levy by $15,050. And as you can see from the memo that's been assembled, we are recommending that the village take the new growth. And the reason that we are asking the village to consider taking that new growth is to offset a portion of the increase that we're going to be seeing in the police pension tax levy to accommodate the lowering of the assumed rate of return from 7.5% to 7.25%. Each and every year when we look at this, there are four choices that we have. We can leave the levy the same as it is. We can increase it by the amount of the new growth. We can increase it by the amount of the CPI. Or we can increase it by the total of the CPI and the new growth. And each of those numbers has been provided to you. This year also, for a little background, I provided you the amount of new growth that we would have been able to accept in the future, or we would have been able to increase our tax levy in the past based on the numbers supplied to us by the county. Just for a little historical background. Questions? The reason we go through the process at this point in time is we need to provide an estimate of our tax levy prior to the actual adoption of the tax levy. So for truth and taxation purposes, that's why we bring it to the board at this point in time with the various scenarios to try and reach a point of determining what our tax levy is going to be for the upcoming year.
So you'll see on page 2 here is the options that are available for the village board. On page 2, we've got 1 through 4 having the same extension as previous year, taking the new growth, the consumer price index, or a combination of the consumer price index and the new growth. As Finance Director DeSharman mentioned here, our recommendation is to take the new growth. We're going to be seeing that increase in the police pension fund contribution of approximately $40,000. What we're recommending is to take this, allow this $15,000 or approximately $15,000 to offset that cost here as we budget for next year. So that's staff's recommendation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have regarding the tax levy.
We can open this up for discussion. Anybody have any comments?
I'll go. How's that sound? Nobody wants to go first on a tax discussion, because who wants to raise taxes? Raise your hand. No one. So nobody wants to do that. I understand that. But as we've been talking in conjunction with some of our unfunded pension liabilities, I think we have to be very financially responsible here. I think a case could be made for, again, I'm not recommending this, so please don't say that this is what I want, but I think a case could be made for taking the full amount, simply because we don't have avenues to increase our revenue streams, and we have expenses that are going to continue to increase. We are going to have union employees get automatic raises and benefits, and those type of things are going to increase. We do not have control over that. Again, I'm not recommending that we do that, but I'm just saying I think we need to have a discussion about what our role is. Our role is to make sure, I mean, we've got to make sure that we're financially solvent to the best of our ability here. And it's our jobs, our obligation here to these types of things that we're faced with. Again, I don't think anybody wants to go out and say, hey, I'm looking to increase taxes. Our property taxes in Illinois are so high that, I don't know anyone that's going to say that they're not too high. They're too high. But we also need to do a good job of educating our residents to understand. I think the majority of our residents believe that their tax bill comes to the village. I still don't think that they understand that all those different, you look at all those different little portions that you're paying out to the school district of 26 or to the MCC or the fire district or all the different taxing bodies, we really don't get a whole lot. And we've got 2 line items. One is for the village, correct? And the other is really for our pension. So I view those as 2 separate issues. That pension, we've got to meet those pension obligations. So new growth to me is not an increased tax on anyone. We're not increasing taxes, or correct me if I'm looking at that incorrectly, Michael. And that's not an increased tax to our residents. It's collecting for the new businesses that have, or new developments, I should say, like Stryker, Garden Place, whoever's come in and is added onto our tax roll, is to make them, that's their obligation that they're going to now pay. Whereas if we don't take that, once it's gone, it's gone. You can't recover it. So we've kept the levy since I've been here. I know we've not increased it at all. So I just looked at this. I did ask to see how much we had in the last X amount of years because I thought it was important from an educational standpoint. So we've had 32,000 in new growth that we've lost approximately, correct, in those 4 years here from 2014 through 2017. So that's lost. Not only that, but it's compounded loss because one year it's one that it adds on and you keep adding on to it. So I think that we really need to be open to this recommendation of making sure that we garner those taxes that these new developments have brought into us, that we want to capture some of that. I mean, we've got to balance, we got to look at how much money goes out, how much money comes in. It's one of those things I think we need to be prudent about this.
If the village board is really intent on reducing that assumed rate of return, even from the 7.25 level that's sitting there, no doubt in my mind, I can tell you that you will be looking at an increase of $50,000, $60,000 a year just to attempt to lower that assumed rate of return in the
Right.
future. Those expenses will continue. And depending on what we can actually earn or what is actually earned within the fund will determine if the amounts that we're gonna owe in any individual year will be higher than that.
Right.
We will get to the point now is, if we leave the village's tax levy constant, or we do not increase it, we keep adding money to the police pension tax levy and reducing the amount of money that's coming to the general corporate levy. So, which means our general fund, one of the funding sources, or the funding source from the property tax, down each and every year by, let's just say, at least $50,000. At some point in time, we'll reach a point in time, unless there's other revenue sources out there that we can replace that with, that the only other alternative is to continue to reduce expenses. And boy, I know, I can attest to the fact in the time that I've been here, the amount of expenses that we've reduced over that period of time. I just think it's something that the board has to be cognizant of, because it's not going to fix itself.
I know Trustee McAlpine had brought up taxes with, new growth with regard to Garden Place apartments, and I know you don't know off the top of your head what they pay in taxes, but can you email? I'm just curious, or the rest of the board, including them, what does Garden Place apartments?
I have to pull it from the.
I know that's, thank you.
But I think that's a misconception, because any new business, any new home pays taxes if we don't approve this. It all goes into one pool of money. So the fact of the matter is, if you have more people paying in, it could actually reduce individuals' tax burden.
Well, I think the point you're making, that if we do not assume the new growth, it would lower the amount of tax that the average resident would pay
Right.
to the village of Perry.
Right.
But I guess the point, which is factual, it's accurate, the point I'm attempting to make is, there is a point in time where I guess it's a matter of everyone is going to pay, I guess, a piece of that fair share to constantly be able to keep up the expenses that we're incurring within the village. I mean, as we know, I mean, this is only one piece of it. I mean, each year when we go through the operating capital budget, we put together a very detailed 5-year plan. And when you look at that 5-year plan and you look at the amount of funding sources that are out there that show the expenses that we can take care of going forward, there's an awful lot of expenses or projects that need to be done that we haven't found the revenue yet to pay for those. Those are in addition to these things, which I just consider operating expenses of the village.
So I have a question for Administrator Reif. In the past year or so, we've had concerns about the funds being passed back from downstate. And this revenue that we collect is only a portion of our operating budget. So
Of our revenues? you're
yes.
talking? Yeah.
So, looking forward here, what are we expecting from the capital as far as our normal allotments?
Are you talking about LGDF?
Yeah, related to LGDF, or that's the portion that we get for
tax. The state had reduced that by 10% the previous year, and they dialed that back where it's
a 5% reduction to municipalities. And that impacted us, impacted all communities here. They're paying that to the village of Cary. We budgeted conservatively for that here this year. We planned on it being another 10%, and it was, as I said, it was changed to a 5%. So we're seeing some increased receipts related to state income tax, sales tax and other revenues they're trending, pretty much flat. As we talked about during our budget workshops here, we have our big three. Property tax is one of them, sales tax is the other, and income tax. Those are the main sources of revenue that are provided to the village of Cary. And those have been flat for probably the last 5 years at least. And it becomes challenging here for us to continue to provide services that our residents expect when we're seeing these revenues that we count on be flat. We have contractual obligations here with our staff. We have benefits that are provided to our staff. They continue to increase. Commodities have increased here. And it's simple math. When you look at it, if revenues are going flat, our expenses are increasing, it becomes challenging. So and just to allude on the fact that here Finance Director Descharmes had mentioned too, related to our other funds, we've talked a lot about the general fund, but we have our capital projects fund, which there isn't a funding source for that. We've talked about that at the budget. Our vehicle and equipment fund, there is not a funding source for that. That was our Meyer material money that was used to pay for that. Our MFT revenue that goes to our roads. Right now, we got a report here recently about our roads, and current funding, we're not able to maintain that level of our road infrastructure that our residents expect. The building fund, land conservancy fund, we have multiple funds where we don't have funding sources for. So it's not just a general fund issue, it's looking at it across the board of all funds. We are concerned about that and what's in the best interest here from a long-term perspective for the village.
I'm kind of going off on a little tangent now, but as you're talking about all this, I'm thinking about what Trustee Cavelli had brought up in the past with regard to, we didn't ever finish that conversation, with regard to charging and making everything fair for different entities that want to go, like, a race that is in Cary. We charge for some people and we don't charge for others. And when we're really trying to tighten our belt, I'd like to go ahead and look at charging organizations and for it to be fair to everybody. Now I'm going off on a tangent here. It has to do with finances, but I would like that to be brought up again because we never did discuss that.
I believe the board made a final decision on that.
We
voted on
discussed that.
Yeah. But to your point, everything's going to be this coming budget year. We're going to have some really challenging decisions to make. It's not going away. And it's a soft, I guess, intermediate help here for the village.
Wait, so hang on, Kim just said that we didn't vote on that the board said that they wanted to go ahead. Majority of the board felt that they didn't want to go ahead and charge different organizations for their services, and that's why it wasn't brought forward.
I believe there was a
Consensus.
Yeah.
Right, so anyways,
consensus on
just
the board.
keeping in mind, everybody, that, when we're tightening our belts and things like that, that we have to say no to some things too. Okay, sorry to interrupt you, Jake, go on.
Yeah. But just continuing here, this coming spring, we're going to have or late winter, we're going to have a tough.
Budget decisions to make, and they aren't going away. It's
Not only going to be for the general fund, it's going to be for all funds. And I understand here, and staff works hard not to bring in new taxes, not to increase taxes. That's not what we're recommending here. We're not going to pass along a tax increase to the residents by accepting that new growth. And that's what we are recommending here from a staff perspective.
Trustee Cavelli, do you have any comments?
I was just going to bring up the contract services again. When you talk about that $40,000 deficit, I mean, that's basically what we were looking at that we spend on these other entities that we do not charge for. And I think we're missing out by not capturing that. And to have this discussion that we're going to capture 15,000 to make up that deficit when that issue is still looming out there, I don't understand that. I won't be in favor of this, just so you know.
Trustee Betts, do you have any comments?
No comment.
Trustee Kraus?
No.
Trustee Cox, or anything else?
Michael, I know what you're thinking. He's going to ask me some tough question about PTEL or whatever, and we're going to get into it. But I'm not. I'm only going to ask you, what do you think I want?
Pardon?
What do you think I want?
Oh, there is no doubt in my mind
Which would be?
that you would keep that tax levy at 2,510,000.
Zero increase.
I
Right.
could have asked me that.
I know.
Maybe in-
Thank you. It was easier this year, right?
But I just,
Well, if we could get some direction from the board, I heard from trustee Kostler here and trustee Cavelli related to this, but just so we know what to bring forward.
I'm not in favor of a tax increase either, or the tax levy increase, or just keeping it at how it is.
Trustee Kraus?
I'm kind of torn between the two, so I think I'd come in and talk with you, Jacob, a little bit more.
Well, I was going to make a recommendation too, that Michael is a great source to come in and sit down and talk to. You get a lot of great information from him. You can put it in terms that are particular to you and what you're looking for, and he can do a comparing and contrasting about different things. It's well worth the 3 hours he'll put forth in your meeting, right, Michael? He'll sit there and, you know, we've gone back and forth ourselves and, you know, different scenarios. What if we do this? What if we do that? You have to be, I know it seems like $15,000 when you're dealing with a general fund of $8.5 million. Doesn't seem like a lot of money, but when you're looking at some of these issues that we're facing, it does start to add up. So, you know, I plan on sitting down again, talking with Michael, as I normally do every year at this time. And I suggest that the other board members as well, Trustee Betts, Trustee Weinhammer. I don't know if you've sat down and talked to Michael about this before too, but I know Trustee Cavelli, you've had conversations with Michael too, haven't you?
No, not recently.
could I make one other point? Just to in the back of the $15,000 that we're asking you to approve this year in terms of the new growth was based on the expansion of the Stryker facility, which is probably one of the larger buildings here in the village of Gary, and the coming on the tax rolls of the apartment complex. Now, in the time that I've been here with the village of Gary, I can't tell you another time when there's been that type of new development that came on the tax roll. And even with that new development, it only equated to $15,000. The reason I'm making the point is, at some point in time, we're gonna be talking about expenses related to capital equipment, capital trucks. There's not too many trucks I can buy for $15,000. But the point I'm trying to make is, if we don't start increasing or finding a revenue source that can offset some of those expenses, to be able to put in a budget or replace some of those vehicles that will need to be replaced is going to be a much harder task than it started looking at some of these decisions today.
From a town where majority of the money that comes in is property tax versus a lot of towns where majority of the money that comes in is from sales tax, from others besides property taxes. How do we become that town?
It's going to be challenging here. It's going to be challenging. It's just, given the land use and how we're set up here, we continue to work at it.
By the nature of being a non-home rule community, there just aren't a lot of revenue sources, or we don't have some of the revenue sources available to us that other communities would. They don't look at the burden, because if they have an immediate need, a home rule community, if a need comes up, an emergency comes up, they just add it to their tax levy. They're not subject to a tax cap. Unfortunately, can you imagine what would happen if something occurred in the village of Gary that was of a large expense? I mean, to some degree, that is why we set aside the amount of fund balance that we do within the general fund for that point in time, and if an emergency were to come along, that we'd have the funds available. But the point I'm trying to make is, there will be many things that we will be looking at just the next few years. More things than I promise you that we will not have enough revenue sources.
I think too, what Trustee Cavelli, you were talking about sales tax specifically, I believe. And with that, again, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for all communities. What is really tough for us is to continue to move that needle. We need to get businesses that there aren't any like businesses in town.
We can add business to the village, but if, say, we're adding another coffee shop or another certain kind of restaurant, people that already spend dollars at the coffee shop. So we need unique businesses that we don't have here. And the way that we're set up, when tracks on one side of Route 14 that restricts how much that we can develop on 14, it makes us challenging. Again, we just have to continue to keep grinding. So there isn't an easy answer for it right now, but I understand the comment.
Well, that's why the Selkie property comes into play so heavily right now, and making it attractive to developers to bring in substantial retail development.
That and 31.
31, yeah, that's going to be our
And
next.
Kim, I think we talked about before doing like a tax. I think you brought up maybe like a food tax, restaurant tax. We were kind of talking about that way. Anyone that's coming
Yeah,
to.
we brought up, and we just discussed it at the
Right, I'm
board.
just saying, we just discussed that those are types of things that we can do, but we're so limited with what we can do. And we talked about that might be an avenue that we're not just taxing people in Cary, we're taxing anyone that's coming here. But I think that we talked about being able to, an accounting challenge with the accounting part of it.
Any other comments? Jake, I think we're heading down the road where no, 0. But we can, I'd like, Trustee Kraus is on the fence here too. If you need some time too, but we can
Yeah,
circle
I'd
back
be
on it.
happy to have more conversations with village board members. I think right now what we're trending is to have this considered by the village board on, at the December 4th meeting. So we have a little bit of time here, but I appreciate the feedback that you've provided.
I'll be more than happy to meet with anyone to talk about any piece of it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Michael. Department head report, Chief Finland?
In your packet, there's a couple documents that relate to statistical information from the police department. The cover memo kind of addresses some of the high points in regards to increases in certain calls for service and decreases in certain calls for service. As you can see there, domestic calls and thefts increased by about 12%, but criminal trespass to land, criminal damage to property decreased by 40%, and the incidence of deceptive practices increased by 170%, but identity theft, which is similar, decreased by 32%. And to kind of put that in context, a global perspective, our deceptive practices went up to this point 17, and identity theft went down 12. So that way,
it provides some context as it relates to there's really a 5 incident increase. You're going to find that on the
final page on the bottom of it. But I also put in here some of the metrics that I might use in regards to information related to proactive or initiated activity in people or in entities that request information from the police department. And I would venture to say that we are the most FOIA'd entity within the village. And remember, all this information that you get, right? So if you kind of extrapolate it out between, if you add, 25%, you're at 196, so you're right at the same amount that you had last year. And if you add 25% to the traffic stops, because we're at 1,837, you're up to 2,296, which puts you in between the years of 2013 and 2015. So I'm just kind of trying to keep it in there in perspective as it relates to these numbers. I also kind of grabbed some of the more indicative clause that I think on the second page or your exhibit B, as it relates to the information that we capture through our records section. So that's more or less just a spreadsheet for you to look at, and it just indicates some of the information that you'll find on that last page, kind of laid out for you, and totals it for the 75% of the year that we're at right now. I also gave you a couple of charts as it relates to activity that we use to assess the performance of our patrol officers, that being business checks, subdivision checks, traffic stops, and mileage. I have to remind you that we can't use the issuance of citations as a performance measure. That's prohibited by law. So you can see that for the most part, if you look at September 2017, you're at 7,145 miles traveled, and in 2018 we had 7,558 miles traveled, and we're very similar as it relates to our business checks and subdivision checks. The one of the more important numbers or ratios that I'd like to bring to your attention that we watch pretty vigilantly is the ratio that relates to our provide information to the state of Illinois Department of Transportation. And what I gave you is a 5-year snapshot of our ratios. What the ratios mean is that the company that does this for the state of Illinois, which is Alexander Weiss Consulting LLC, they have determined the minority population of a community, and they will base over 15 years of age. So they take the minority population, actually the population, and they determine minority population based on the 2010 census. And then they look at the population of 15 years and older. So they take that, they compare our traffic stop data to that, and you get a ratio of, if you're higher than 1, then you're stopping more minority motorists than the ratio your population makeup. If you're lower than 1, then you're stopping less minority motorists. And as you can see, and this is something that's very important to me because there's issues related to allegations of bias, policing, things of that nature. We are very close to that ratio of 1. So it's something that I take very seriously, and I monitor vigilantly, and we also look at our data that we collect from our individual police officers as well. And finally, that last page is something that you've seen previously. It's a report that's produced by our records section, and it captures data as it relates to the month in 2017 versus the month in 2018. And then it also has your year-to-date totals and then the percentage of change. Some of the issues that you can see there's 11% increase in domestic, almost 12% increase in domestic calls. However, when you go down and look at the domestic battery arrests, you'll see that those are down. They're down by 21.9%. But what you will see is that our service calls are up, especially as it relates to like our assisting the Cary Fire Department. They're up by 51.8%. We accompany them on the majority of their calls. Blackouts are up 25%. And then some of the criminal incidents that we handle are burglaries and thefts, and they're up 18% and 12% respectively. So that's kind of the highlights of the report as it relates to 9 months into the year. I'd be happy to take any questions that you would have.
Any questions for the chief?
No?
Thank you.
Great job, thanks.
Thanks, Pat. Okay, moving on. I will entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session to discuss pending or imminent litigation, Illinois 120/2C11, and closed session minutes review, Illinois 120/2C21.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We will convene as soon as the boardroom